In Hearthstone, mini-sets have become a means for the devs to extend the lifespan of an expansion by introducing a small number of cards that usually spice up the meta enough to keep standard fresh and exciting right up until the next expansion launches. And historically speaking, the mini-sets have been overwhelmingly successful at achieving this. Sure, some of the cards may eventually come to frustrate the community, but that's just a testament to how powerful and impactful some of these cards were when they launched. But with the release of Maw and Disorder, we haven't really experienced that injection of new life into the game that typically comes with a mini set. The community had a brief flirtation with jailer decks the first few days, but those fell off pretty fast as win rates plummeted. And as time has passed, we've seen this steady regression back towards the same decks from the previous Murder at Castle Nathria meta that include almost none of the new Maw and Disorder cards. Now, this has never really happened before ever in the whole history of the mini sets. So I thought today we'd examine Maw and Disorder to figure out what exactly went wrong with it, and if there's anything that Blizzard can do to salvage this mini set, or are we going to have to endure this meta until the next expansion? So starting with what went wrong, the consensus from the community seems to be that the new cards are weak, which to be honest is a relatively fair assessment. But I believe that there's actually a larger issue with Maw and Disorder that becomes very apparent when you take a step back and compare it to past successful mini sets. Problem number one, there are way too many reactive cards included in Maw and Disorder. And by reactive, I mean cards that serve as removal or disruption. If you don't know what those are, ask your parents. Roughly 15 of the 35 new cards could potentially be classified as reactive, depending on how loose your definition is. But regardless, that's basically double the amounts that were in the previous Throne of the Tides mini set. Now, don't get me wrong here. Reactive cards are definitely important to have in Hearthstone, and we certainly felt their absence way back when in the United in Stormwind expansion. But reactive cards don't typically enable new archetypes, and more so just slot into existing decks. So for this reason, it seems like things were stacked against Maw and Disorder from the start. Because with reactive cards making up more or less 1/3 of the set, it left less room for the devs to include proactive cards, such as win conditions, threats, synergistic payoffs, or even card draw. And typically, it's these kinds of proactive cards that push new archetypes or decks. Now, that's not to say that Maw and Disorder was doomed from the start for this reason, only that there was less room for error, and the remaining cards really needed to pack some power to save the set, which takes us to the next issue with Maw and Disorder. Problem number two, Maw and Disorder introduced relatively weak proactive cards. Going back to Throne of the Tides, that mini set gave us cards such as Clownfish, Herald of Nature, and Shatter Shambler. These cards all fundamentally changed how you could build decks for the respective classes to, varying degrees, and are still seeing play at the moment. Then in Onyxia's Lair mini set, we got Kazakazan, who completely transformed Hearthstone overnight into an entirely different game. But with Maw and Disorder, we got the Jailer. Personally, I was always rather skeptical of the Jailer being good, but a lot of the community were actually pretty hyped on this card.
I don't know. I think this card is nuts, man.
And to their credit, the Jailer did actually look quite formidable in the early days of Maw and Disorder due to Bunny Hopper debating the entire Hearthstone community with his rank 1 legend Paladin deck. But then players realized that immune creatures are actually quite easy to deal with, and also remembered that Theotar just exists, which led to an almost immediate collapse of all Jailer decks because the card was just too much of a liability to play, let alone build your entire deck around. Now, it's easy to point and laugh at the Jailer, but the majority of proactive class cards in Maw and Disorder were also relatively weak across the board, and didn't really lend themselves well to any new strategies. Rogue essentially got a worse Wildpaw Knoll, Shaman got a worse Walking Fountain, and poor Warrior got whatever this is supposed to be. But what compounds this issue even further is that Hunter, which was the best class going into Maw and Disorder, got relatively good proactive cards compared to the other classes. Shadehound has actually given rise to a new kind of Hunter deck that brings together these forgotten token beast cards into a deck that's actually quite formidable, while Nathanos, on the other hand, just conveniently slots into the best Hunter deck in the game and doesn't really enable anything new at the moment. That being said, I'm confident that someday Nathanos will facilitate some kind of new Death Rattle Hunter, but the pieces aren't really there yet for that kind of archetype to take shape. And this is a sentiment we see echoed in some of the other classes in Maw and Disorder, which begins to touch on the last big problem of the set. Problem number three, Maw and Disorder pushed incomplete and also just bad archetypes. Secret Mage and Secret Rogue were both designated so many card slots in the mini set, and even a tech card to keep them in check, which is so unfortunate because these were amongst the most underwhelming archetypes of Murder at Castle Nathria. And for these archetypes to be successful, they needed significantly more support and help. Now, to be fair, these cards were probably locked in well before the devs knew just how bad Secret Mage and Rogue were, so I won't fault them too much here, especially since they are aware that this was in fact a misstep, and in the future it seems like they'll try to support support secret archetypes by having the core sets do the heavy lifting instead of expansions and mini sets. That being said, I will fault them a bit more for bizarre inclusions like Due Process and Habeas Corpus, which feel like the beginnings of new Druid and Warlock archetypes. With Druid, it seems like Mill Druid is coming our way down the line, while perhaps Warlock gets a new big death rattle or some kind of combo deck in the future. And we've seen the devs plant the seeds for future archetypes like this in the past, but they usually tend to plant those seeds in the full expansion, with the rest of the archetype support arriving in the following mini set. Recently, we've seen this with Belinda from Alterac Valley receiving support with Drakefire Amulet in Onyxia's Lair, as well as with Celestial Alignment from Forged in the Barrens, which was, believe it or not, a meme card at the time. And then in Wailing Caverns, we received Anacondra. And well, we know how that one went. Sure, sometimes there's a mini set card like Smokescreen that has no real synergistic prospects when released, but in this case, Rogue received 2 cards to support different established archetypes at the time, so this wasn't as big of a deal. And while one could argue that Warlock got some okay cards to make up for Habeas Corpus, anyone who tells you they know what's going on with these new Druid cards is an absolute liar. Incarceration is bad, and it should feel bad. Now, I know it may seem like I'm nitpicking the cards here because, well, I am. The reality is that there are only 35 cards in a mini set as opposed to a full expansion, which is something like 135 cards. And with so many reactive cards that don't push new archetypes, coupled with weak proactive cards that fail to have any impact, Maw and Disorder really couldn't afford to have big misses like the secret archetypes or cards that have no hopes of seeing play on release. Now, all of this begs the question, can anything be done to save Maw and Disorder? To that I say, maybe. I can see Hunter nerfs at the very least making it so you're not encountering Hunter every other game, and a Theatar nerf would be wonderful for not just my mental health but also my blood pressure, but overall I'm not sure if Maw and Disorder is bringing enough new complete mechanics and ideas to the table to really change the status quo, even with buffs to the set. Like if you buff a piece of removal like Life Sentence or Disruption like Prosecutor Meltranix, that won't magically create new Mage and Demon Hunter decks that play out dramatically different than the decks now, so I wouldn't be surprised if we actually see buffs to older cards, particularly with Warrior because they've been struggling for a while now. This may sound all doom and gloom, but there is one ray of hope I have for Maw and Disorder that I've been tiptoeing around this entire video, and that would be Paladin. It's hard to believe, but in my opinion, Paladin actually received the best cards in the mini set. Not just speaking in terms of power, but rather how these cards accomplish what a mini set should do. Class Action Lawyer may be more of a reactive card, but it's a reactive card that's also a powerful synergistic payoff that unlocks a new flexible tempo option for pure Paladin, as opposed to a card like Theft Accusation, which feels more like a convoluted The Light of Burns with more steps, rather than like an actual reason to play Thief Priest. Then you've got Jury Duty coming in to support Dude Paladin, much how the powerhouse of a card Arbor Up was able to revive Token Druid way back when. And finally, Order in the Court has encouraged players to completely re-examine how they build Paladin decks, similar to how Clownfish fundamentally changed Shaman in Throne of the Tides. And these cards have actually come together to enable this super fun and surprisingly powerful pure Dude Paladin deck, which is on the verge of being a serious competitor. So my hope is after the balance changes, this deck can rise up as the new hotness to spice up a metagame that has become rather stale the past few weeks. So overall, Maw and Disorder may go down in history as the first real misstep with the mini sets, just due to how it's basically had no impact on Standard. But if Paladin is any indication, it still brought good ideas to the table, and let's be honest here, the flavor and the puns were actually quite on point in this set. Then as for the ideas that didn't necessarily land, they will serve as teachable moments to inform the design of future mini sets and ensure that the next one is just that much better. So all of that being said, what do you think about Maw and Disorder? Let me know down in the comments. And if you like this kind of analysis, make sure to check out my best decks so far video where I give my thoughts on not just the best decks, but also the current state of the metagame. And of course, if you made it this far, make sure to like and subscribe because you're probably digging something I'm doing here. But in the meantime, stay superior, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Later. Get that